It's been 6 months since Puerto Rico was devastated by one of the largest hurricanes on record. For the most part, everyone outside of the island has moved on. And this fading interest represents one of the biggest problems in how we think about natural disaster recovery. Americans have never been shy about donating money after a natural disaster. But where that money goes and how effectively it's spent is just as important as the amount raised. And in that regard, there's a lot of room for improvement.
The biggest mistake is that people think by giving immediately they solve the problem.
That's Bob Ottenhoff, the CEO of the Center for Disaster Philanthropy. He advises some of the largest foundations in the world on how to give effectively to natural disaster recovery efforts.
70 or more percent of all dollars given to disasters is given within 30 days after the disaster occurs. And as a result, there's lots of things that are left out that don't receive financial support.
One of those things that doesn't get the money it needs is long-term recovery efforts. The Red Cross budget for Hurricane Maria shows that a majority of funding went to the immediate relief effort, whereas only 13% will go to long-term recovery. Data gathered by the CDP show that on average, recovery and reconstruction only receives 5% of total funding. Part of the reason for this discrepancy in funding is the way disasters are covered in the news. A 2012 paper published in Journalism and Mass Communication Quarterly found that 62% of stories about natural disasters appeared within 30 days of the event. Looking through data for last year's biggest hurricanes, you'll see a similar pattern. Google Trends shows a spike and then an immediate and permanent drop-off in public interest. Hurricane Harvey, Irma, and Maria were mentioned about 18,000 times on TV news networks, according to archive.org transcripts. 75% of those mentions came within 30 days of the natural disaster. And that coverage shapes how donors understand of disaster recovery and then give towards it. More attention and footage of people handing out food and water means more money towards the organizations that specialize in doing just that. But relief efforts like this are just the beginning of a long road to recovery.
There's going to be a very long and difficult and complex recovery period.
Disaster experts tend to look at 4 stages of a recovery. Relief is the first phase, and it's primarily focused on getting people food, water, and temporary shelter. This is the part you typically see on the news. The second stage is about patching things up as quickly as possible. Tarp roofs, makeshift bridges, that sort of thing. And this is where the money starts to run dry. The last 2 stages are what Bob means when he says recovery and reconstruction. Those are the ones that get 5% of total funding combined. Recently, Puerto Rico entered this stage of the recovery process. And after talking to Bob and other experts, I wanted to see what this neglected stage looks like. Last year, the island made headlines when Maria destroyed its entire electric grid. 6 months later, 11% of the island still doesn't have power. But this was a disaster waiting to happen.
This is an image of the electrical system, and as you can see, a lot of the production is on the south, so we have to transmit that power to the north through forests and inaccessible areas of the island.
To see what Jose means, take a look at this infrared map of Puerto Rico at night. You'll notice a majority of the population lives in the north, in and around San Juan. Now look at where the 5 biggest power plants are located. 4 or 5 are in the south.
You know, it's a perfect recipe for just losing the whole power grid in one event like this.
Resilient Power wants to decrease this reliance on a single fragile grid. They're working with companies like Tesla and building off-grid solar systems in the communities hit hardest by Maria.
We have identified now over 150 community centers and clinics that are recipients.
The community is seeing people that not normally would be able to consider a solar installation because of the costs. The upfront costs are too high.
Innovative long-term recovery projects like this have the ability to not only save money, but save lives too. A great example of this is Japan's approach to flood recovery in the 60s. The government invested in recovery and mitigation projects that had an incredible effect. In the 40s and 50s, thousands of people died every year from floods. By the end of the century, that number had dropped almost zero.
What is going to be something that is going to really make a systemic change? We're not just putting a Band-Aid to something.
Comprometidos is another organization trying to rebuild a better Puerto Rico. They're providing grants and assistance to small business owners, elderly people, and farmers so they can get back on their feet.
If we're going to go into, for example, agriculture, well, let's do this right. What are the best practices? How can you increase productivity? If we're going to build houses, how can we build houses that are resistant to future natural disasters?
While in Puerto Rico, I couldn't help but think about how crazy it is that projects like these receive so little attention and funding. What's even more staggering, though, is that local organizations like Comprometidos and Resilient Power only receive 2% of that already tiny fraction of funding. In Puerto Rico, these statistics paint a scary picture of the future. Before the hurricane, the island was dealing with an economic depression. 40% of the population lived in poverty. Young people were leaving the island in droves, worsening a historic debt crisis. In fact, one of the reasons for the electric grid's failure was the fact that PREPA, the island's utility, couldn't find engineers to maintain its power lines. They'd all left for the mainland. Maria exacerbated all of these problems. A recent study estimated that the poverty rate rose by as much as 10% after the hurricane. FEMA estimates that between 40 to 60% of small businesses closed permanently. And economists writing for the New York Times predict that Maria could lower incomes by as much as 21% over the next 2 decades. Long-term recovery after a natural disaster is always important, but nowhere is this more true than Puerto Rico, an island on the brink.